So for our gospel lesson today, that's going to be taken from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11, verses 16 to 19, then verses 25 to 30. This can be found on page 9 of the New Testament of your pew Bible. But to what will I compare this generation? It's like a child sitting in the marketplaces and calling to one another. We played the flute for you and you didn't dance. We wailed and you didn't mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. Verse 25. At that time, Jesus said, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you've hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent and have revealed them to infants. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
What an amazing biblical text. What hope, what comfort. I'm very glad to be back with you. I was here last Sunday, and I'm very glad to be here this Sunday. I wish it were under happier circumstances. I just want to say God's grace and peace and comfort to you, those of you that knew dear, amazing Robert Sloan, doctor and pastor, New Testament scholar, mentor, someone to look up to and to emulate for many of us young ministers and young Bible scholars and academics and so on. God's grace and peace to you during this time, and God's wisdom as you kind of take little tiny steps forward over the next couple of months. God's grace and peace to the staff here as well. I am glad to be back. I nevertheless did have a small bone to pick with those of you that were here last time, okay? So I made the terrible mistake of going back and watching a little bit of the video clip of my sermon, okay? If any of you ever speak or do anything in public like that, just don't do it. It's a bad idea. During the moment, you're like, I'm kind of crushing this. And then you go back and you watch and you're like, why am I staring like that? Why do I keep touching my face? Why won't anybody tell me to stop? And I'm like fixated on this side of the room. And anyway, the bone to pick is that none of you told me after, okay? So next time, if I'm that off base, please do let me know. No, just kidding. It is great to be back with you and great to think about this biblical text. I'm joining with you this morning in trying to think into a couple of things that Jesus says at the end of this discourse in Matthew 11, and trying to think about how it applies to my life and your life, and not least in this immediate time as a body of believers here at Heights Church processes the loss of a great pastor, a great shepherd, and mourns together and has hope together and grieves together and does all that in some sense Christianly, tries to figure out what it looks like, what it feels like to try to do all that Christianly. So I want to think this morning about Jesus' saying at the end of our biblical text in Matthew 11. That famous thing where Jesus says so affectionately, come to me, all of you that are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. What an amazing promise. What knowledge Jesus himself has of his own person and his own mission to be God's peace in person, to be God's grace and hope in person, to be the person in whom walking around Galilee, walking around Capernaum and Nazareth, and now by the Spirit moving in our midst, the God who holds out his arms and says, "Come to me, all of you that are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. My yoke is easy, my burden is light, and you will find rest for your souls." I think all of us on a daily basis want to say yes to that summons of Jesus. On a regular basis, we want to say, "I want your yoke, I want your easy burden, I want your peace." Particularly today, as we gather together after the news of the past couple of days with Robert Sloan, I wanted to focus on what does it look like to take Jesus' yoke of consolation upon us. Here's what I mean by that. I want to think this morning about two things that I think that are really important for us as Christian human beings. Paul the Apostle has this famous line in 1 Thessalonians 4:13 where he talks about people that grieve, but people that grieve not without hope, right? And there are those 2 points that Jesus insists upon. Yes, being a people that grieves, but being a people that grieves with hope. I want to think this morning about how we try to do both those things. That is the distinctively Christian shape. That is the distinctively Christian shape of consolation. Both being a people that are allowed to grieve well, and nevertheless a people whose grief is contextualized by a great, great hope. This is what I want you to think about this morning. The first thing I want to come to is foundational, simple, straightforward Christianity one-on-one, or Christianity 101. Why should we be people of hope? Why? Think about all the difficult things in your own life. Think about the tragedies in your own life. Think about the tragedies going on in the wider world. There are plenty of reasons to despair. There are plenty of reasons to be upset, to be broken, not to be okay. Right? Plenty of reasons to do that in your own life. Plenty of reasons to see that in the wider world. We see what I like to call the effects of Genesis 3 all over the place. Genesis 3 runs straight through our lives. It runs straight through our communities. It runs straight through our world. So we don't really need to be convinced to despair, right? No one has ever had to convince an adult that there are reasons to be in a bad mood, right? We kind of start to intuit that very early on. We know, we feel that the world is and can be a Genesis 3 place. So why not give ourselves over? Why not just let ourselves be washed down the stream of despair, of pessimism, of hopelessness, and so on? For Christianity, there's one straightforward answer to this. The early Christians were absolutely convinced that when they came to that little tomb hewn in the rock early on Sunday morning, some 2,000 years ago, that he was not in it. They really thought he is not in that tomb. Jesus isn't here. He is risen. If you'd ask the early Christians, Peter or James or Paul or whoever, why do you have any reason for hope? Don't you see the thorns and thistles of Genesis 3 running straight through your life and running straight through the cosmos? The answer is, we heard a story and believe it, that when the women went to the tomb on Easter morning, he wasn't there. And then he met us. And then he met us on the mountain. And then he met us through the locked doors of the room. And then Thomas himself sunk his hands into his pierced side. And then we jumped out of the boat in bewilderment and swam to the shore. And there was this strange figure that turned out to be Jesus, who was cooking fish, who was comforting Peter, and so on. They believed that God had raised Jesus from the dead. The key point about this is it's often assumed by people outside of this church, outside of other churches on this Sunday morning, in the wider world, that basically what do Christians believe? And sometimes it gets radically watered down, right? Well, they basically believe there's some kind of God, and that God is somewhat favorably disposed toward us. And something happened with Jesus a long time ago in Jerusalem. And they kind of hope that when they die, they'll get to spend eternity with God. But basically something like that. The rest of the world just rumbles along in absolute brokenness. And that's basically the sum total of what Christian faith, Christian hope is about. That is not what Christian faith and Christian hope is about. It's not just about some nice feelings or ideas about some God some place far away that might be favorably disposed toward us sometimes. It's about the hard, concrete belief that Jesus' bodily resurrection is a fact of our universe, and it points toward the fact that one day God will make all things new. That's what the early Christians believed. They saw in Jesus' bodily resurrection from the tomb, they saw that death had somehow been defeated, that it had been dealt a death stroke itself, that death and brokenness and curse were somehow being reversed, that in Jesus overcoming death, rising from the dead, ascending into heaven, pouring out his Spirit, that God was somehow reaching down into the post-Genesis 3 dust of the world and ripping out the thorns and thistles of the cosmos. That we have in our hearts and minds now, for those of us that believe in Jesus, that have been baptized, we have the same Spirit. We have the same Spirit that brought Jesus' body out of the tomb on Easter morning. We are the reversing of death faith. We are not just the faith of happy optimism and good vibes and kind ideas. We are the undoing of death faith. That's what Christian faith is about. That one day death will be completely and ultimately overcome. The early Christians would have said, Jesus wasn't there on Easter morning. We saw him bodily raised from the dead. And now we know that one day, everything bad and broken about this world will come untrue. The thorns and thistles of the broken cosmos will be uprooted, burned in the fire, never to sow seeds of brokenness and injustice again. Let me make a few more points about the early Christian belief in the resurrection of Jesus. All this is in the context of thinking about those last few lines from our New Testament lesson. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. What does it look like when you're broken and mourning, coming to Jesus to be comforted? What is the shape of Christian mourning? What is the shape of Christian consolation? That's what I'm wanting to think about. And the most foundational thing is why believe in hope and consolation at all. And I've told you, the early Christians believed that in Jesus' resurrection, they saw the truth that God could undo the king of brokenness itself, that is, death. Now, let me say a few more things about what the early Christians thought about resurrection. The early Christians didn't just reinterpret death and give it a positive spin. They didn't just try to find a silver lining in a story of the brokenness of the world that never gets reversed, never gets healed, never gets better, but let me kind of reinterpret for you what death's about so that we can find a little bit of consolation from that. That's not what the early Christians did. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. The early Christians didn't say, I went to the tomb and his body was there and it was already rotting away. And that's probably evidence that the Genesis 3 state of the world is eternal, perpetual, unhealable, and irreversible. But I have this belief that though brokenness and death may never be defeated or reversed, that maybe our souls can go off to heaven and enjoy some kind of bodiless, immaterial bliss with God, and the story of this world, of God putting humans in it, and waterfalls and rainbows and mountain ranges and physical human beings. The devil kind of won that. We just lost it. That whole creation project, we just lost it. Jesus' body is evidence of that. He's still in the tomb. He died. But maybe we can reinterpret this as we will go off somewhere else, and death isn't really defeated, but we're allowed kind of an escape and to live in immaterial bliss with God. That's not what the early Christians thought. That's not what the early Christians thought. Because that's a story not of death being defeated, but of death being cleverly reinterpreted. And that's not what they thought. What they thought is, in the bodily resurrection of Jesus, in that one instance, death itself had been turned back. It had been told no. It had been reversed. God, in the Son, turned the story backwards, past Genesis 11, Genesis 6-9 with the flood, past Genesis 3. He reversed the story of brokenness and sin. And one day we believe that our loved ones who have died, who are, as Paul says, with Christ right now, which is far better. We believe, yes, we believe they're with Christ. Yes, we believe that's far better. Yes, we believe they have peace beyond understanding. Yes, we believe they have freedom from all their brokenness and sinfulness and frailty and all that. But we believe even more than that one day God will look at the brokenness and atrophy of the entire universe, every atom, every split second of time, and take it back from the corrosive forces of sin and death and decay. The story at the end of Revelation is not of God being defeated by death and losing the world he made to the demonic forces of the dragon and the beast and so on. But we get to wisp a few people away to a place called heaven or something like that. That's not the way the Bible ends, because in that story, God doesn't win back his creation. Jesus' body stays in the tomb. Death just gets reinterpreted. No, death is defeated, and one day it will be defeated at last. You know, you go to these, I didn't plan on saying this, but you go to these graveyards in churches or funeral homes, whatever the case may be, and obviously I think it's beautiful to memorialize people you care about, and it gives a specific location where you can focus and sort of localize your mourning and your respect and your love and the focus of your emotions, and all those things are good, appropriate. I'm glad we do it. But I don't know if any of you else ever feel this way. Sometimes when I go to graveyards, I think, I'm really glad we do this, to memorialize this, to put up a tombstone, to mark the time period in which they lived, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also something, wonderful though all that is untrue and that will eventually be proven to come untrue, which is this tombstone and this body in the ground is the present Genesis 3 brokenness of the world. But it's not the end of the story. It's not the truest part of the story. The truest part is this person, Paul says, is now with Christ, which is far better. That's the truth. If you see that tombstone and that person, wonderful as it is to memorialize and all that, and you think that's the whole truth, we've missed it. This is not the whole truth. Paul says they are with Christ, which is far better. And then we have a bigger truth still. One day, God will raise such bodies from the dead and defeat death finally at last. He will redeem his whole creation. Heaven will come to earth. The New Jerusalem, Paul says, will come down like a bride from heaven and will renew and heal this whole broken world. Death itself will be undone. Death itself will be undone. So it's really important when we think about the shape of Christian hope that it's not just optimism in spite of the obvious and inevitable brokenness of the world. That's not what it is. It's not lots of terrible things happen. Those will never be accounted for, but I'm really good. My faith is about developing an amazing ability to see silver linings straight the way through that brokenness, and I'm optimistic about those, and that's basically the best that Christian faith can do. Christian faith is not about finding silver linings of optimism in a Genesis 3 world. The Christian faith is about knowing and believing, because of what happened to Jesus on Easter morning, that one day all of that brokenness will be undone and will be healed. We won't have to look for silver linings. We won't have to try to see the bright side, because the whole thing will be made new. The whole thing will be glorified. So this is the shape of Christian hope, okay? So we have hope. But what I want to talk about now is, what does it look like to grieve as a Christian, right? To grieve as a Christian. Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians having a grief which comes from God, that's productive, that's got Christian shape to it, that's not the way the world grieves. So what does it look like to grieve as a Christian? How do we do that? The first thing, obvious as it is Christians cannot succumb to the nihilism of the wider world. That's a denial of what God has done in the resurrection of Jesus. This is not a Christian response. When your neighbor comes to you and says, this old awful place is miserable, it's going to get worse and worse and worse, and really there is nothing to be positive about, to say back to that, oh yes, I know it is, the world is terrible, society is terrible, it's inevitably going to get worse and worse and worse. We cannot succumb to the increasingly pervasive nihilism in the wider world. Our grief can't become that. Our grief can't flirt with that. Our grief can't turn into that. Our hope precludes that as an option for how we feel in the world. We can't be nihilistic because we know that one day God is going to make all things right. And the reason I want to say a couple of things about grief here as well, that I grew up in a small town in Cleveland, Tennessee. I don't know if any of you it's right outside of Chattanooga. I'm actually quite famous there. I'm kidding. You go there and say my name and virtually no one will know who that is. But anyway, from a small town in Cleveland, Tennessee, very close to the Georgia line. And most of the churches in that context you've got Southern Baptist churches, you've got Pentecostal churches. Of course, you've got the whole range of denominations, but mostly it's Southern Baptist and Pentecostal. And in my college days, I was in and out of a number of different church contexts. I won't specify which one, but a number of different church contexts where it was implied that because you're a Christian and because Jesus died for you and because Jesus rose for you and because one day you will be with Jesus and healed, that it's not acceptable or appropriate to grieve. I don't know if any of you have ever been in a context like that. It may not have been stated to you, but it's just implied that grief is somehow out of place if you're a Christian. It's not an appropriate thing to do. It's an indication that you're insufficiently moored in the joy of the Lord, in the hope of salvation, in the certainty of heaven and new creation and all of that, that it's just something that you shouldn't do. But I want to say that Paul gives us a few images on how to grieve Christianly that I want to say a few things about. One of the things that's good about grief is it shows, if it's handled appropriately, that you are based in reality, that you're based in Christian reality. It doesn't do your psyche, your heart, your life, or your community any good when tragic things happen to pretend as though you're too good to grieve. It doesn't do anyone any good. In fact, to reject grieving is to reject the fact that we still live in a Genesis 3 world. It's still broken. There are thorns and thistles all around us. And it's okay when you see a thorn or a thistle not to pretend like it's a rose. It's okay to say, my mind and heart is responding toward this right now in acknowledgement of the fact that this thing here was not originally planted in the garden. This was not supposed to be here. I am broken, hurt, upset, mad, whatever the case may be, because you are Adams and Eves in God's garden walking around and saying, that is not supposed to be here. That drug addiction, that alcohol problem, this financial struggle, this person's death, whatever the case may be, there's a Genesis 3-ness about it that you as a Christian made in God's image rightly say, I'm really not okay about this. I'm really not okay about this. You're not supposed to be okay about this, right? God doesn't want us to pretend that the entire story of the Bible goes from creation to glory and nothing bad happened in between. He doesn't want us to pretend like that. In fact, it's an indication that you're insufficiently moored in the shape of the story. You need to have that Genesis 1 and 2 sense of vocation and calling and meaning in God's image. You need to have that joyful sense of the free gift of God's grace and salvation in Christ. And you need to have that humble limp that recognizes that there are still thorns and thistles in this cosmos that poke us, that hurt us, that make us not okay. This is a good thing. This is another thing that I want to say in this regard is beware of this. One broaches seriously contested theological topics at their own peril. I won't get too much into this one, but to say a few pastoral words. Some people are tempted because of their view of God's providence, which is a good thing. It's not a bad thing to believe that God's in charge. It'd be really bad if he weren't. But it's a good thing to believe and affirm God's providence. But some people, in trying to work that out, are lured into a view where every single individual thing that happens in the world somehow issues directly from the purpose, plan, will, and character of God. Pastorally, I would be a little careful about that. Here's why. It's a way of taking your view of God's sovereignty and also making him the one who sowed all the thorns and thistles. There are Genesis 3 things in this world that did not issue directly from the character and will and purpose of God. it's not healthy for you or wise for you to take every thorn and thistle and try to convince yourself in some mysterious doctrine of God's providence that God planted this thing directly himself. This is one of the key things in Romans 8. Famous text, so often misunderstood, Romans 8:29. Romans 8:28 famously says, God works all things together for good. But Paul doesn't say all things are good. He doesn't think all things are good. In fact, he knows some things just aren't good. This is not how God wanted the story to go sometimes. He wanted free human beings that could love him and love one another, and that was to run the risk of all sorts of things happening that don't issue directly from the good and perfect will and character of God. So all things aren't good, but by God's grace, all things work together for good. In the mysteries of God's providence, when it's all done, we will look back and see that he's carried us through, that it's been okay, that we're going to be okay, and so on. So all this is informing. All this is informing, if you're wondering where I'm going with all that, all this is informing what it looks like for Jesus in our New Testament lesson to hold out his arms and saying, come to me and I will give you rest. And the question is, what does it look like to mourn and to have hope, as Paul tells us to do both? To mourn and to have hope in that embrace of Jesus. How does Jesus comfort us? Does he tell us, stop crying, don't be upset? You should know, you have all sorts of wonderful things. I've blessed you, I've saved you. That's out of place. Enough of that. He doesn't do that. That's what Jesus says. Now then again, if we were just to be given over to, as Paul says, a grief that's really not from God, not in any way ultimately productive, it's become just a sense of, I don't believe God can or will do any more good in my life or in the world, then Jesus wouldn't be for that either, right? But he's got this embrace that lets us to grieve in a godly way, but to grieve in a way in which we have hope. Let me say just a couple more things and we'll be done. Yeah. This is really not fun. One of the things I really worry about is, so I've grown up in America. I love it here. We just had our 250th anniversary of our nation. So many wonderful things. It's not just America. I've not lived a ton of places, but I've lived in the United States. I've lived in Scotland. I've lived in England. And this was, depending upon where you were, more or less true of all of those places, is that in the modern Western world, with all of our medicine and technology and arrogance about what those things can accomplish, we really hide from death. We have all sorts of strategies for how not to think about it, how to block it away somewhere. It used to be the case that in most churches, right, you couldn't every Sunday or whenever you met, you had to walk right through the churchyard and see so-and-so that prayed with you, and so-and-so that led you to Christ, and so-and-so that got cancer, and so-and-so that was in a car accident, and so on, right? Any of you that have lived in non-Western cultures will know that it's a little bit unusual the way that Western people we've got medicine and technology, and we don't want to talk about death. We don't want to think about death. We don't want to be around death. Put the graveyards as far outside of the city limits as possible. We want them on a beautiful hill, but don't cover it with trees. Don't want to see it. Don't want to think about it, and so on and so on and so on. Here's the thing I worry about. The Solomon in Ecclesiastes tells us to think about death. He tells us to think about death. It's not because he's morbid. It's not because he's dark. I don't know. I didn't know him. But I don't think it's because he's just unusually dark and morbid. It's because thinking about our finitude does a couple of things. It gives us a great sense of gratitude for the grace of being alive at all. It reminds us of how precious it is. It reminds us that it's like a vapor and it could be here and gone. And in particular, I'm talking about grief and hope. You think about death, you think about meeting Jesus. You think about knowing Jesus and being loved by Jesus. You think about the resurrection of Jesus. You think about heaven. You think about the new heavens and new earth. It's one of the things I worry about. When I think about the future or those things, and when I'm in a congregation talking to people about that with somebody that's just died, or even if someone hasn't, for so many of us, doesn't it? It can start to feel like a fairy tale. I sure hope that's true. I don't know. I've got some fuzzy visions about it. I try not to think about it that much because I really don't want to think about death. And so, well, so-and-so's in heaven and the golden streets, and one day we'll be with Jesus. How much do we believe that? And how seriously do we actually take that? And how much of our not thinking more about that, because we don't want to think about death, robs us of that robust sense. Come Lord Jesus, come Lord Jesus. I've always been terrible at that prayer because I don't want him to, I'm the age that I am. I've got ambitions. I've got a wife. I've got kids. There's other stuff I want to do. The medicine and the doctors and all that. Maybe who knows how long I can live. I'm going to have, I want to have a long run here, that sort of thing. Right? The early Christians, I'm not saying those are bad things to have ambitions and hopes and dreams, etc. The early Christians, that just would have been inconsistent. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? Don't you want to be with Jesus? Don't you want Jesus to come back? How seriously do you take this? How much do you actually believe this? So, in closing, I just say, we need to think about death because we need to think about Jesus. We need to think about being with Jesus. We need to think about eternal things. We need to believe these eternal things. We need to have a strong, just an unshakable faith and hope and certainty that these things are true. Our beloved that die are with Christ. Sure and more certain than the dead body that we see. They are with Christ, and Christ will return. Thank you.